Every Saturday night, my son called me with the exact same question. Dad, are you alone? For months, I always told him the truth. I told him yes. But last Saturday, something felt wrong. The air in my house felt too still, and a sudden, unexplainable instinct took over. So I lied. I told him no. I told him my neighbor was over. That single split-second lie saved my life. What happened next uncovered a devastating secret that shattered my family and forced me to do the unthinkable. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a family member who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Howard. I am 69 years old and a retired commercial contractor. I spent 40 years building warehouses, office complexes, and retail centers across the Midwest. I know how structures are put together, and more importantly, I know when their foundations are cracking. My wife Diane passed away 7 months ago. Since then, the sprawling suburban estate we built together felt more like an empty fortress than a home. I poured every ounce of my architectural knowledge into this house. I reinforced the frames, I laid the foundation, and I installed the security systems myself. That is why I knew every single sound this house makes. At exactly 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, the landline rang. I was sitting in my leather recliner staring at the muted television. I picked up the receiver. It was my son, Gavin. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my week was, or if my arthritis was handling the winter chill. His voice was flat-clipped and completely stripped of any warmth. Dad, are you alone? This was his ritual. Every Saturday night, like clockwork, he asked that exact question. I was about to give him my usual answer, which was a quiet yes, when I saw it. Through the sheer curtains of my living room window, the motion sensor floodlight illuminating my driveway flickered on. A shadow, thick and fast, swept across the frosted glass. My chest tightened. My contractor instincts kicked in immediately. I know the perimeter of my property perfectly. A stray raccoon or a heavy branch blowing in the wind does not trigger the upper sensor on that light. Only a full-grown man does. Gavin repeated the question. His voice was sharper this time, carrying a strange, breathless urgency. I asked if you were alone, Dad. I looked at the flickering light outside, and then down at the heavy plastic receiver in my hand. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I lied. Actually, no, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Leon from next door came over. I had a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink, and you know Leon. The stubborn, retired Army mechanic cannot resist a home repair project. He is staying for a couple of beers. There was a beat of absolute dead silence on the line. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath. Before I could ask Gavin what was wrong, the line went dead. He simply hung up. There was no goodbye. There was no tell Leon I said hello. Just the hollow dial tone echoing in my ear. I slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. My mind began to race, connecting dots I had deliberately ignored for months. The weekly phone calls had not started right after Diane died. For the first 4 months of my profound grief, Gavin barely checked on me at all. He and his wife Rachel were too busy taking vacations and upgrading their leased vehicles. The Saturday night calls only began the exact month Diane's life insurance policy paid out. It was a substantial amount deposited cleanly into my primary trust. I vividly remembered how Gavin had shown up at my door just 3 days after that deposit cleared. He paced around my kitchen demanding a massive loan to salvage his failing private security firm. I had refused him point blank. I had worked 18-hour shifts to pay cash for his entire college education, so he would not start his adult life in debt. I was not going to drain Diane's final safety net to fund his reckless business choices. He had stormed out furious and bitter. Since then, the only contact I received was this weekly chilling check-in. Dad, are you alone? The sudden violent crash of shattering glass snapped me back to reality. It came from the back of the house, the heavy sliding patio door. My heart hammered against my ribs, but 4 decades on chaotic, hazardous construction sites had taught me how to compartmentalize panic. I did not yell out. I did not reach over and turn on the living room lamps. I moved silently through the dark hallway, stepping only on the extreme edges of the floorboards, where I knew the custom oak would not creak. I reached the hall closet and wrapped my fingers around a heavy solid steel flashlight I kept on the top shelf. I crept toward the kitchen archway, keeping my breathing shallow and completely controlled. The freezing Midwest winter air was pouring into the house through the shattered safety glass of the patio door. Standing directly in the middle of my kitchen linoleum was a figure dressed entirely in black tactical gear. He was tall, heavily built, and standing completely still, just listening to the dark house. He must have heard the faint crunch of my boots shifting on a stray piece of glass. He whipped his head toward the dark hallway where I stood concealed in the shadows. Before he could take a single aggressive step toward me, the heavy, unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine echoed from outside. It was my neighbor Leon pulling his large truck into his driveway, right next to my property line. The bright headlights swept rapidly across my kitchen walls, illuminating the intruder face for a fraction of a second. The intruder panicked. Operating under the assumption that Leon was walking straight into my house just as my phone light had suggested, the man let out a vicious, panicked curse. He scrambled backwards, his heavy boots slipping wildly on the broken glass. In his frantic rush to escape through the shattered doorframe, his elbow violently struck the edge of my granite kitchen island. Something metallic clattered loudly against the floor tiles. The man did not stop to retrieve it. He vaulted over the patio railing, crashing through the frozen bushes, and disappeared entirely into the dense tree line bordering the backyard. I did not chase him. I stood perfectly still in the freezing darkness, waiting for any sign of a hidden accomplice. I listened to the wind howling through the broken doorframe. I did not walk over to the wall phone to call the police. An elderly widower reporting a fleeting shadow in the night would be heavily patronized by the local dispatch. They would send a young officer to do a half-hearted patrol sweep and ultimately dismiss me as a confused, paranoid old man. I needed to understand exactly what kind of threat had just breached my home. I flicked on the heavy steel flashlight, aiming the blinding beam directly at the kitchen floor. Lying next to the shattered safety glass was a small black leather pouch. It had fallen open when it slammed against the tiles. I knelt down, ignoring the sharp glass pressing into my knee, and picked it up. Inside the pouch rested a highly specialized, high-end electronic lockpick and bypass set. The precision metal tools gleamed under my flashlight beam, alongside a digital decryption fob utilized specifically for bypassing commercial-grade deadbolts. I know commercial security hardware. I spent my life installing it in corporate buildings. This was not the sloppy, crude toolset of a random neighborhood burglar looking to steal a television. I turned the leather pouch over in my rough hands. I recognized the manufacturer logo embossed directly into the material. It was a highly restricted proprietary brand. It was the exact brand of advanced security hardware Gavin exclusively distributed and sold at his failing firm. The freezing air rushing into the destroyed kitchen suddenly felt completely secondary to the glacial ice running through my veins. My own son had not just been checking on my well-being every Saturday. He had been repeatedly calling to clear the target. I did not reach for the phone. I stood perfectly still in my kitchen, clutching the leather pouch of specialized lockpicks. I knew exactly what would happen if I dialed 911. A tired dispatcher would answer. I would report a shadow in the yard and a broken glass patio door. 2 young officers would eventually cruise up my driveway, shine a flashlight into the bushes, and ask me if I had taken my medication tonight. They would look at my gray hair, look at the empty house, and write a generic report about a confused, grieving widower hearing noises. I could not afford to be treated like a fragile victim. My son had just sent a professional to breach my home, and I needed to know exactly what else had been compromised before I alerted anyone. I left the kitchen lights off. I moved through the dark corridors of my house, relying entirely on muscle memory. I checked the front door and found it perfectly secured. I checked the heavy windows in the guest bedroom, and they were locked tight. But as I approached the solid oak door leading down to the basement, A sharp, metallic scent hit the back of my throat. It was faint at first, masking itself beneath the cold winter draft, blowing in from the shattered patio glass. I took another step forward, and the smell grew incredibly thick, coating my tongue with the distinct, sickening flavor of raw, natural gas. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I did not flip the wall switch. I did not even turn on my steel flashlight. 4 decades of working as a commercial contractor, wiring massive warehouses, and laying foundations for industrial complexes taught me the absolute laws of hazardous materials. A single spark from a cheap light switch or a tiny static charge from a flashlight button in a confined space filled with gas would ignite a shockwave powerful enough to level the entire property. I gripped the wooden handrail and descended the stairs in total darkness. The smell grew suffocatingly thick as I reached the concrete floor. My eyes burned fiercely, and my lungs protested with every shallow breath. I moved my hands along the cold cinder block wall, navigating entirely by touch toward the utility closet where the main furnace sat. When my fingers found the thick iron pipes feeding the furnace, I traced them downward to the primary shutoff valve. My stomach plummeted. The heavy brass lever, which requires significant intentional force to turn, had been wrenched entirely open. This was not a slow, accidental leak from an aging pipe. The valve had been deliberately forced to maximum output. The intruder had not come to steal my television or rifle through my late wife's jewelry box. He had come to flood the foundation with lethal gas. If my neighbor Leon had not pulled his truck into the driveway, when he did, the intruder would have finished his work. If I had simply gone to sleep after Gavin hung up the phone, I would not have woken up. I gripped the brass lever. My hands are thick and calloused from 40 years of swinging hammers and pouring concrete, but the valve was stubbornly stiff. I braced my heavy boots against the concrete floor, ignored the burning lack of oxygen in my lungs, and forced the heavy lever backward until it locked firmly into the horizontal shutoff position. The hissing sound of escaping gas immediately ceased. I blindly navigated toward the high basement windows. I unlatched them and shoved the heavy glass panes outward, letting the freezing midnight air flood the basement. I leaned against the damp concrete wall, pulling desperate gulps of clean air into my lungs. The freezing wind bit into my skin, but it grounded me. It kept my mind razor sharp. As the toxic air slowly cleared, my eyes adjusted to the thin streams of moonlight cutting through the open windows. That faint light illuminated a corner of the basement I had intentionally kept hidden behind stacked cardboard boxes and old winter coats. The boxes had been carelessly shoved aside. Sitting completely exposed on the concrete floor was my heavy fireproof document safe. I walked over to it, feeling a cold dread replacing the adrenaline in my veins. The heavy steel door of the safe was slightly ajar. I knelt on the cold floor and examined the digital keypad. There were no scratches on the metal. There were no pry marks around the steel hinges. The intruder had not taken a crowbar to the locking mechanism. The security light on the keypad glowed a steady, faint green, indicating the correct digital passcode had been manually entered. Only 2 people in the world knew that specific sequence of numbers: me and my son, Gavin. I pulled the heavy steel door fully open and reached inside. The safe held the vital architecture of my life, but I did not need to turn on a light to know what was missing. My fingers brushed against the familiar stacks of old tax returns and my vehicle titles, but the thick manila folder that always rested squarely on top was completely gone. That folder contained the original deed to this house. The property was fully paid off, possessing a current market value of $1.2 million. Alongside the deed was an even more dangerous set of documents. They were the comprehensive medical proxy and enduring power of attorney forms. My late wife Diane had insisted we draft them when she first got sick. The forms were designed to grant the holder absolute legal authority over my health care and financial decisions should I ever become incapacitated. They were supposed to be an emergency failsafe to protect our family. I sat back on my heels, resting my hands on my knees. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The weekly phone calls from Gavin were never out of concern for my loneliness. He was confirming my isolation. He waited until he knew I was alone, then sent a man with specialized tools to break into my home, open my gas valve, and empty my safe using the combination I had entrusted to my only child. Gavin had always been drowning in debt. I paid cash for his entire college education working overtime on brutal construction sites, so he could step into the corporate world with a clean slate. I thought I was giving him freedom. Instead, I had cultivated a profound sense of entitlement. He viewed my sacrifices as his birthright. His wife Rachel was consumed by status, constantly pushing him to finance luxury cars and country club memberships they could not afford. When Diane passed away and her life insurance policy deposited a massive sum into my trust, Gavin had immediately demanded it to bail out his failing security firm. My refusal had not ended the conversation. It had simply forced him to change his tactics. If the house had filled with gas and I had died in my sleep, Gavin would have inherited everything cleanly. But the break-in had been interrupted by my neighbor. The intruder had fled before he could finish the job, leaving the shattered patio door and the open gas valve as glaring evidence of foul play. I stood up slowly, my joints aching from the cold concrete. Gavin was desperate, but he was not stupid. He and Rachel were calculating predators. If they realized the lethal trap had failed, they would not simply give up and walk away. They possessed my original deed and the medical proxy. They held the legal keys to my entire kingdom. They would pivot. They would formulate a new strategy to validate those stolen documents before I could alert my attorney or the authorities. I walked back up the wooden stairs, leaving the basement windows open to purge the remaining ghoul. I returned to the living room and sat heavily in my recliner. I did not clean up the broken glass in the kitchen. I did not secure the shattered door. I sat in the freezing dark house watching the clock on the wall tick toward morning. I knew exactly what was coming. They would need to establish a narrative. They would need to prove that the old man living alone had finally lost his mind. I did not close my eyes for a single second. I waited for the sun to rise, completely prepared for the ambush I knew would arrive with the dawn. The headlights of a heavy luxury sport utility vehicle swept across my frosted front windows at exactly 7 in the morning. I had not slept a single second. I sat perfectly still in my leather recliner, waiting in the freezing shadows of my living room. The heavy oak front door unlocked with a sharp click. Gavin still possessed a spare key from the days when I actually believed a father could trust his son. He pushed the door open and burst into the hallway with Rachel close behind him. Their performance was meticulously rehearsed. Gavin breathed heavily, running his hands through his hair to simulate blind panic, while Rachel clutched her expensive designer handbag against her chest, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. "Dad, are you okay?" Gavin shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He rushed into the living room and stopped dead when he saw me sitting in the chair. We drove straight over. "You sounded completely confused on the phone last night. You were rambling about shadows and broken glass, and then you just hung up on me." His lie was incredibly smooth. He was actively rewriting the history of our phone call to establish my supposed mental decline. Before I could respond, the freezing draft blowing in from the shattered kitchen door carried the faint, lingering metallic scent of raw natural gas into the living room. Gavin froze. He flared his nostrils and his eyes widened in an exaggerated display of horror. "Oh my God, do you smell that?" Rachel covered her mouth with her manicured hand, backing away toward the front door as if she were about to faint. Gavin did not wait for my answer. He sprinted past me and threw open the basement door, rushing down the wooden stairs. I sat quietly listening to his heavy footsteps on the concrete floor below. He was marching down to the utility closet to play the hero. A minute later, he pounded back up the stairs holding the heavy brass wrench I kept on the workbench. His face was flushed with manufactured outrage. "Dad, you left the main furnace valve wide open," Gavin yelled, slamming the wrench onto the coffee table. The heavy metal struck the wood with a violent crack. You flooded the basement with gas. If we had not driven over here this morning, you would have blown yourself to pieces. You could have leveled the entire neighborhood. I looked at the heavy brass wrench, and then I looked at my son. It requires immense deliberate physical torque to open a commercial-grade gas valve. A frail, confused old man does not accidentally pry it open while looking for a light switch. Gavin knew this perfectly well. He knew I had spent 40 years on commercial construction sites handling hazardous materials. I knew how to lock down a building better than any man alive. But he needed this narrative. He needed me to be a danger to myself. I did not raise my voice. I did not call him a liar. I simply let my shoulders sag forward, feigning the exact exhaustion he expected to see. I do not remember touching the valve, I whispered, keeping my gaze fixed on the floorboards. Rachel stepped forward immediately, sensing her opportunity to close the psychological trap. She knelt beside my chair and placed her cold, perfectly manicured hand over mine. She wore a thick, cloying perfume that instantly made the air in the room feel suffocating. Howard, you have to admit that things have been slipping, Rachel said, her voice dripping with a sickening, artificial pity. Ever since Diane passed away, you have not been yourself. We see it. The neighbors see it. The grief is simply too much for your mind to handle. You are forgetting conversations. You are leaving doors unlocked. And now this. You almost ended your own life today. Hearing her speak my late wife's name felt like a physical blow to my chest. Diane had always seen right through Rachel. Before the cancer took her, Diane had warned me that Rachel's expensive tastes and ruthless social climbing would eventually push Gavin into a corner he could not escape. Diane told me to protect the estate because Rachel viewed our savings as her personal lottery ticket. I had ignored the warning out of a foolish desire to keep peace in the family. Now that peace was being weaponized against me, Gavin stepped up right beside his wife, forming a solid physical barricade between my chair and the front door. He reached inside his heavy winter coat and pulled out a glossy, thick brochure. He dropped it onto the coffee table right next to the brass wrench. We cannot let you live like this anymore, Dad, Gavin said, crossing his arms over his chest. It is completely irresponsible of us to leave you alone in this massive house. We found a place. It is called Sunny Meadows. It is a premier memory care community. They have 24-hour lockdown security doctors on staff and people your own age you can talk to. I stared at the brochure. It featured a picture of smiling elderly people playing cards in a sunlit room. I knew exactly what kind of facility Sunny Meadows was. It was a high-security restrictive ward designed for patients with advanced violent dementia. Once a person was committed and signed over their legal rights, the facility locked the doors and heavily medicated the residents to keep them compliant. It was an expensive holding cell for the unwanted. You need to come with us right now, Rachel said, standing up and smoothing her coat. We cannot risk leaving you here for another hour. Gavin walked over to the front door and pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the hallway closet. He dropped it onto the floor. The heavy thud indicated it was already full. We packed a bag for you last week, Dad. We knew this day was coming. We just gathered your comfortable clothes and your toiletries. The profound violation of that statement echoed in the silent room. They had been inside my house while I was sleeping. They had rifled through my bedroom drawers, picking out my clothes and packing a bag for my imprisonment. They had been coordinating my removal for weeks, probably laughing about how easy it was going to be. Every instinct I developed during 40 years of managing rough, unforgiving construction crews screamed at me to stand up and throw them both out into the freezing snow. I wanted to grab Gavin by his collar and demand he look me in the eye and admit he opened the gas valve. But the cold, rational contractor inside my head took absolute control. If I yelled, they would immediately call the police. They would show the officers the open gas valve, the shattered door, and the packed bag. They would point to my anger and declare it a violent dementia episode. The police would escort me to the hospital for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, and Gavin would automatically gain emergency control over my estate. I would be handing them the exact victory they needed. I needed to buy time. I needed them out of my house so I could reach my attorney. I buried my face in my rough hands. I forced my breathing to hitch and tremble, projecting the image of a broken, terrified old man who had finally realized his mind was gone. "I am so tired," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I am just so tired of being alone in this big house without Diane." Rachel smiled. It was a quick, triumphant smirk that she failed to hide before her face settled back into a mask of fake sympathy. "I know, Howard. We are going to take care of everything now." I slowly lowered my hands and looked up at Gavin with wet, pleading eyes. "I will go with you," I said softly. "I know I cannot stay here anymore. But please, Gavin, give me one last day. Give me today to walk through these rooms and say goodbye to your mother. Give me Sunday to pack a few of her photographs. I give you my absolute word as your father. I will drive myself to the facility tomorrow morning and sign the voluntary admission papers." Gavin shifted his weight, looking nervously at Rachel. He clearly wanted me in the car immediately, but the prospect of a voluntary admission changed the legal landscape entirely. If I walked into the facility and signed the papers willingly, they would not have to fight a messy court battle to prove my incompetence. A voluntary surrender was the cleanest, most profitable outcome for them. Rachel gave him a barely perceptible nod. She believed she had completely broken my spirit. She believed the sudden realization of my own supposed insanity had crushed my will to fight. "Okay, Dad," Gavin said, his tone dropping into a sickeningly patronizing cadence. "You can have today, but we are calling the facility to expect you at 9 tomorrow morning. If you are not there, we are coming back with an ambulance, and we will not be asking for your permission." I nodded slowly, shrinking deeper into my leather chair. "Thank you, son." They turned and walked out the front door, closing it firmly behind them. I listened to their heavy boots crunch across the frozen driveway. I listened to the powerful engine of their luxury vehicle roar to life and fade away down the suburban street. The moment the sound of their tires vanished completely, my posture snapped straight. The trembling old man evaporated. I stood up from the recliner and walked directly to the large oak bookshelf dominating the far wall of the living room. Rachel had spent far too much time admiring my antique book collection during her last visit. I reached behind a thick, leather-bound encyclopedia, and my fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. I pulled it out. It was a tiny, high-definition wireless camera broadcasting directly to a remote server. They had planted it to monitor my movements and record my supposed decline. I did not crush the camera. I did not throw it against the wall. I simply walked over to the television stand, reached behind the heavy wooden cabinet, and violently yanked the primary internet router cable straight out of the wall jack. The green light on the camera instantly died. My house was completely dark and freezing cold, but my mind was burning with absolute clarity. They wanted to steal the empire I built with my bare hands. They were about to discover exactly why I was the man who built it. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter and walked out the front door, heading straight for my truck. I needed to see Stephen. The sound of their luxury car engine faded down the frozen street, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed my heavy wool coat, my keys, and the black leather pouch containing the lockpicks from the kitchen counter. I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt. The freezing morning air bit at my face as I climbed into my truck, but I barely felt it. The panic they expected me to wallow in was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating machinery. I navigated the icy suburban roads, heading straight for the commercial district. I was not going to a hospital, and I was certainly not going to the police. I was going to the only man who could match the ruthless pragmatism I needed right now. Stephen operated out of a sleek, high-rise office building downtown. He was a corporate attorney who specialized in asset protection and hostile takeovers. I had known him for 30 years. We had negotiated brutal union contracts and navigated commercial real estate deals together. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he knew my mind was a steel trap. I bypassed his receptionist, ignoring her polite greeting, and walked directly into his private office. Stephen looked up from his dual monitors, his eyes narrowing as he took in my rigid posture. I did not offer a handshake. I did not ask about his family. I reached into my coat pocket and dropped the black leather pouch onto his pristine mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy metallic thud. Then I pulled out the glossy Sunny Meadows assisted living brochure and placed it right next to the lockpicks. Stephen looked at the tools, then at the brochure, and finally up at my face. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply reached out and picked up the lockpicks, examining the proprietary logo of the security firm Gavin owned, stamped on the leather. Then he opened the brochure, scanning the restrictive committal policies of the memory care ward. His jaw tightened. Without uttering a single syllable, he turned back to his monitors and began typing rapidly. I sank into the heavy leather guest chair and watched him work. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp clatter of his keyboard. While he navigated through the encrypted portals of my trust and estate files, my mind drifted to the immense financial sacrifice I had made for my son. I remembered the grueling 18-hour shifts, pouring concrete in the dead of summer and framing warehouses through the bitter winters. I had done it all to pay cash for the entire college education Gavin received. I refused to let my son begin his adult life shackled by student loans. I wanted to hand him a clean slate. But sitting in that quiet office, I realized my greatest sacrifice had been a fatal error. A clean slate simply meant Gavin never learned the agonizing weight of a dollar earned through physical labor. It taught him that wealth simply appeared when he needed it. He viewed my life savings not as a safety net I bled for, but as his own delayed entitlement. Stephen paused his typing. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning a digitized document. The blood drained from his face, leaving a mask of pure professional fury. He turned one of his large monitors around to face me. He did not try to soften the blow. "Howard," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "your son did not just break into your house to scare you. He accessed your safe to steal your medical proxy." Stephen pointed to a timestamp on the screen. The document had been electronically filed with the county clerk at 9 o'clock on Friday morning. Gavin had utilized the emergency clauses my late wife Diane and I had drafted years ago. But he had not just filed the paper. He had attached a preliminary medical addendum declaring me temporarily incapacitated and incapable of managing my own financial affairs. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. The pieces of the trap were locking into place with terrifying precision. I asked Stephen what Gavin was using the proxy to access. I knew my liquid assets were shielded by dual authentication, but the proxy granted sweeping emergency powers over the physical estate. Stephen opened another secure tab connecting directly to the commercial lending division of my primary bank. He brought up a pending transaction that made the room spin. Gavin was not just trying to steal whatever cash I had left in checking. He had leveraged the stolen medical proxy to initiate a massive commercial equity loan against my house. The property was fully paid off, free of any liens, and held a current market value of $1.2 million. Gavin was attempting to extract $800,000 in raw cash against the estate. Stephen pulled up the destination routing numbers for the pending loan. The funds were not going into a care account for my supposed medical needs. They were designated for a direct corporate injection into the security firm Gavin operated. The business was completely bankrupt. He was drowning in commercial debt, and he was using my home as the collateral to save himself from total financial ruin. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering. Gavin had turned on my gas valve not just to kill me, but to ensure the property transferred to him cleanly. When his hired intruder failed and the gas leak was discovered, he and Rachel immediately pivoted to their contingency plan. They needed to lock me away in a restrictive memory care ward under heavy sedation before the bank finalized the massive loan. If I was locked inside Sunny Meadows, I could not answer a phone call from a loan officer. I could not walk into a bank branch and prove I was of sound mind. I would be completely neutralized while they stripped the equity out of the home I built with Diane. Stephen looked at me, his expression grim. Howard, the bank requires a final in-person signature to release an equity loan of this magnitude, even with a medical proxy on file. The deadline for that signature is Wednesday. The timeline suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Today was Sunday. Gavin and Rachel had demanded I surrender myself to the facility by Monday morning. They were trying to get me out of the house and heavily medicated so they could physically force me to sign the final bank documents while I was under the influence of chemical sedatives. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover of my entire life, and they were operating on a ruthless ticking clock. Stephen picked up his desk phone. He asked me if I wanted him to call the police department and file immediate charges for breaking and entering fraud and elder abuse. I looked at the lockpicks on the desk. A simple arrest for a botched break-in would not strip Gavin of his power of attorney. He would hire a defense lawyer, claim the medical proxy was filed out of genuine concern for my failing mind, and tie my assets up in probate court for years. An arrest would only wound him. I did not want to wound my son. I wanted to dismantle his entire world, just as he was trying to dismantle mine. I reached across the desk and gently pushed the phone down, ending the dial tone. I told Stephen that the police would only freeze the board. I instructed him to quietly draft an irrevocable blind trust, transferring every single asset I owned far out of the reach of my son. But before Stephen could agree, the silence of the office was shattered by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. I pulled it from my pocket. It was Rachel calling, demanding to know why I was not answering my landline at home. The psychological siege was continuing, and I had to play my part flawlessly. Stephen turned the monitor back toward himself. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the closing documents for the commercial loan Gavin had initiated. The screen illuminated Stephen's tight jaw. He looked at me and stated that the bank had flagged the transaction. A loan of $800,000 against a fully paid property required a final in-person signature from the primary deed holder. Stephen tapped the screen. The deadline for that physical signature was Wednesday at noon. The timeline snapped into brutal focus. The shattered patio door and the open gas valve last night were Plan A. If I had died, the house would have passed to Gavin free and clear. When I survived, they seamlessly transitioned to Plan B. Sunday morning, they ambushed me with the brochure for Sunny Meadows, demanding I surrender my freedom by Monday. If I was locked inside a high-security memory care ward, heavily sedated, and officially declared incompetent by their corrupt doctor, Gavin would activate the stolen medical and financial proxies. By Tuesday, he would have absolute legal guardianship. On Wednesday morning, he could confidently walk into that bank and sign the equity loan documents on my behalf. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. The cold realization washed over me, bringing with it the memory of my late wife, Diane. During her final days in hospice care, her breathing had been shallow and ragged. She had gripped my hand with surprising strength. She told me to watch our son closely. She said Rachel had a hunger for status that could never be satisfied. Diane warned me that Rachel's expensive tastes would eventually drag Gavin underwater, and if I was not careful, Gavin would drown me just to keep himself afloat. I had dismissed her words as the anxiety of a dying woman. I had wanted to believe in the fundamental goodness of the boy we raised. Diane saw the rot spreading in his foundation long before I ever smelled the gas. Stephen reached for his desk phone again. He insisted we call the authorities immediately. He wanted to bring the police to the house, show them the forced lock on the basement valve, and have Gavin arrested for breaking and entering. I pushed his hand away from the receiver. I told Stephen that calling the police was a tactical mistake. A simple arrest for property damage or trespassing would only yield a minor charge. Gavin would post bail by sunset. More importantly, an arrest would not automatically invalidate the medical proxy he had stolen from my safe. He could hire a defense attorney and argue that the break-in was a desperate attempt by a loving son to check on a father suffering from severe dementia. The courts would freeze my assets for months, while lawyers argued over my mental competency. I would be trapped in a grueling legal purgatory while Gavin drained my accounts to pay his defense fees. I needed a weapon that required no police intervention, I needed a permanent, unbreakable shield. I instructed Stephen to draft an irrevocable blind trust. I wanted absolute ownership of the estate and every single liquid asset I possessed transferred into a corporate holding company. I told him to structure it so that the holding company was controlled entirely by the trust, rendering my personal signature absolutely worthless to any bank. If Gavin managed to drag me to a notary or force a pen into my hand, the documents he signed would be legally void. He could not borrow against a house I no longer owned. Stephen nodded slowly, absorbing the sheer finality of the maneuver. He warned me that drafting an irrevocable trust of this magnitude in 48 hours would require calling in his entire legal team. He also cautioned that once the trust was executed, I would lose direct personal control over my own property. I told him to make it happen. I had spent 40 years building this wealth, and I was more than willing to lock it away forever if it meant severing my son access to it. Before Stephen could ask for the beneficiary details, the heavy silence of the office was shattered. My cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen. It was Rachel. She was supposed to believe I was sitting in my freezing living room, too terrified and confused to function. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. Rachel's voice pierced the speaker, shrill and vibrating with frantic energy. She demanded to know exactly where I was. She said she had been calling the house landline for 20 minutes, and I had not picked up. Her tone was not laced with concern. It was the sharp, aggressive cadence of a warden realizing an inmate was missing from their cell. She was tightening the leash, attempting to map my exact coordinates and ensure her psychological isolation campaign was holding firm. I slowed my breathing. I injected a slight waver into my voice, letting it tremble just enough to project total defeat. I told her I was walking through the local hardware store, looking for plastic sheeting to tape over the broken patio door. I said the house was too cold, and I could not think straight. Rachel let out an exaggerated sigh of frustration. She ordered me to go straight back home and stay inside. She said wandering around town in my deteriorated mental state was exactly why she and Gavin were moving me to Sunny Meadows tomorrow. She promised to send a repairman for the door and abruptly ended the call. I lowered the phone. She had not called to help me. She had called to verify my compliance. Stephen looked at me from across the desk, his fingers poised over his keyboard. The war had officially moved from the shadows into the light. I told Stephen to finish drafting the trust immediately because my family was preparing to lock me away, and I needed to spring the trap before they closed the cell door. I pressed the phone to my ear and remained completely silent. Rachel did not wait for a greeting. Her voice poured out of the small speaker, dripping with a sickly, sweet, artificial warmth that made my stomach churn. She told me she was just checking in to make sure I was safe. She said that seeing me so confused and terrified this morning broke her heart, and that she and Gavin were just trying to do what was best for our family. I did not take the bait. I did not ask her about the gas valve or the shattered glass. I simply asked her what she wanted. Rachel let out a soft, theatrical sigh. She said she had been making some very difficult phone calls all morning. She told me that out of an abundance of caution for my physical safety, she had taken the liberty of contacting my bank and my neighbors. She specifically mentioned calling Leon next door. She told me she had warned them all about my severe dementia episodes. She said she instructed them to monitor me closely and to disregard any paranoid stories I might invent, because my mind was deteriorating rapidly and I was prone to dramatic hallucinations. She was systematically cutting my communication lines. She was wrapping a psychological tourniquet around my life, ensuring that if I cried out for help, the entire neighborhood would write it off as the tragic delusions of a broken old man. She told me to just stay inside and rest until they came to collect me tomorrow morning. Then she disconnected the call, leaving me listening to the dead air. I lowered the phone. Stephen watched me from behind his mahogany desk. I told him I needed to leave immediately, and that he needed to have that blind trust ready for my signature before the sun went down. I walked out of the high-rise building and climbed into my truck. The cold logic of a commercial contractor told me I could not rely on assumptions. I needed to test the structural integrity of the cage Rachel had just built around me. I needed to know exactly how much damage she had inflicted on my resources. I drove directly to the main branch of my bank. It was a massive brick and glass structure, sitting perfectly on the corner of the commercial district. I knew the building intimately. 30 years ago, I led the construction crew that laid its foundation. I oversaw the pouring of the concrete and the framing of the reinforced vault. I knew the bank manager David since he was a junior loan officer fresh out of college. We had shared cigars at his promotion party. When Diane was diagnosed with cancer, David had personally arranged the financial structuring to handle her medical bills. I walked through the sliding glass doors, expecting the usual warm greeting from the staff I had known for decades. Instead, the security guard at the front desk tensed when he saw me. He immediately reached for his radio. I walked straight to the teller counter and presented my identification. I asked to withdraw $5,000 in cash from my primary checking account. I needed liquid capital to operate outside of Gavin Digital Reach. The young teller scanned my identification, and her eyes darted nervously toward her computer screen. She did not open her cash drawer. She told me to wait just one moment and hurried away toward the back offices, looking back over her shoulder as if I were a dangerous intruder. 2 minutes later, David emerged from the glass corridor. He did not extend his hand for a handshake. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was drawn into a mask of deep, uncomfortable pity. He gently guided me away from the main counter and toward his private office, taking careful, measured steps. Once the door was closed, he did not offer me a seat. He simply stood behind his desk, looking at me as if I were a ghost. David spoke to me slowly, enunciating every syllable as if he were addressing a fragile child. He told me he received a very concerning phone call from my daughter-in-law earlier this morning. He said Rachel had forwarded an emergency medical addendum, claiming I was experiencing violent cognitive decline and posing a severe risk to myself and others. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told David that I was standing right in front of him. I reminded him that we had played golf 3 weeks ago. I told him I needed my money and that Gavin and Rachel were manipulating the system to drain my accounts. David looked down at his polished shoes. He said his hands were completely tied. The medical proxy Gavin filed automatically triggered the bank internal emergency elder protection protocols. The system had frozen all massive outbound transfers and capped my daily physical cash withdrawals to an absolute minimum. He told me he could only authorize a maximum withdrawal of $200 for basic groceries and incidentals. He said it was for my own protection until the medical professionals could stabilize my condition and verify my competency. I stared at David. This man had known me for 3 decades. He had watched me manage multi-million-dollar commercial accounts without a single mathematical error. Yet one phone call from a manipulative woman and a forged piece of paper had completely erased my legacy in his eyes. The bank I physically built from the dirt up was now holding my own resources hostage. I did not argue. Arguing would only reinforce the narrative Rachel had carefully planted in his head. If I raised my voice or slammed my hand on the desk, David would call the security guard and document my aggressive behavior. I nodded slowly, accepting the profound humiliation. I told him I understood the protocol. I asked for the $200. David handed me the thin stack of $20 bills. His eyes were completely filled with sorrow. He told me to take care of myself, Howard, and that he hoped the doctors could help me find some peace. I walked out of the office and back through the glass doors of the bank into the freezing afternoon air. The situation was infinitely more dangerous than a simple theft. Gavin and Rachel were not just trying to steal my house. They were suffocating my ability to fight back. By weaponizing the banking protocols, they had effectively severed my financial oxygen. I could not hire outside help. I could not purchase emergency transportation or a hotel room. I was a millionaire trapped with $200 in my pocket. I climbed back into my truck and gripped the steering wheel. The cold leather grounded me. Rachel thought she had checkmated me. She thought isolating me from my neighbors and freezing my bank accounts would force me to surrender peacefully to the facility transport tomorrow morning. She believed she had stripped away every defense mechanism I possessed. She did not realize she had just given me the exact parameters of the battlefield. They had sealed the perimeter, but I was still inside the walls, and I had tools they could not possibly anticipate. I started the engine and put the truck in gear. I had to return to the house. The trap was fully set, and I needed to be sitting right in the center of it when they came to spring the final mechanism. My silence was no longer a symptom of grief. It was the foundation of their absolute ruin. I drove my truck away from the bank and navigated the icy suburban streets. The stark reality of the $200 resting in my pocket cemented the severity of Rachel and Gavin plans. They were systematically cutting off my oxygen. I turned onto my street and slowed the vehicle. A sleek silver sedan was parked carelessly against the curb in front of my house. A young man wearing a thin gray suit and a cheap overcoat was standing on the frost-covered lawn. He was trampling over dormant rose bushes, holding a digital camera up to his face and snapping pictures of my roofline. I pulled the truck into the driveway and put it in park. The heavy crunch of my boots hitting the frozen gravel alerted the stranger. He spun around, nearly dropping his camera in the snow. I read his body language instantly. It was pure, unadulterated fear. A legitimate bank appraiser carries a quiet, professional detachment. They schedule an appointment, and they wear credentials on a lanyard. This man looked like a cornered animal. I walked up the driveway, closing the distance between us. I asked him exactly what he was doing creeping around my property. The young man swallowed hard and stammered. He told me his name was Mark and that Gavin had sent him to appraise the house for the upcoming equity loan. I suppressed the immediate urge to grab him by his lapels and march him off my property. I needed to understand exactly what phase of the operation Gavin was executing. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I painted on a wide, disarming smile, playing the part of a harmless, confused old man who was just happy to have a visitor. I told Mark it was far too cold to be standing out in the biting wind. I invited him inside for a hot cup of coffee to warm up before he finished his work. He hesitated, looking nervously toward his car, but the freezing temperature forced his compliance. We stepped into the foyer, and I pushed the heavy oak door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I led him into the kitchen. The lingering metallic scent of natural gas was completely gone, replaced by the sterile chill of a house slowly losing its warmth. Mark gripped a thick leather clipboard tightly against his ribs. He refused to take off his coat. I watched him with the practiced eye of a construction foreman, evaluating a lying apprentice. I moved to the coffee maker and started pouring 2 dark mugs. I asked Mark how long he had been in the commercial appraisal business. Mark shifted his weight uncomfortably and claimed he had been doing it for 5 years. I handed him a steaming mug and leaned back against the granite island. The verbal dissection began. I asked Mark how he factored the commercial-grade poured concrete foundation into his current valuation. I casually mentioned that I had laid a reinforced steel skeleton under the main floor to properly support the massive cantilevered deck in the backyard. I asked him about the current market adjustment for high-tensile steel joists compared to standard residential timber framing. Mark stared blankly at the dark liquid in his mug. He attempted to bluff his way through the conversation. He muttered something vague about standard load-bearing wood supports and basic residential coding. He used entirely the wrong terminology, calling a primary structural stanchion a decorative pillar. I listened quietly, letting him dig his own intellectual grave. 30 years of managing massive construction sites had taught me how to spot a fraud in 30 seconds. Mark knew absolutely nothing about architecture or real estate valuation. He was a proxy. He was a hired hand sent by Gavin to expedite a hidden agenda. I pressed harder, letting the silence stretch between my questions to maximize his discomfort. I asked Mark if the bank usually required a full structural soil test for an equity loan on a property sitting this close to a natural municipal watershed. The completely fabricated question made Mark go pale. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the freezing draft still creeping through the house. The psychological pressure of pretending to be an expert in front of the man who literally built the structure was breaking his nerve. Mark placed his coffee mug on the counter with a trembling hand. He asked if he could use the restroom before he began measuring the interior square footage. I pointed down the long, dim hallway. Mark practically sprinted out of the kitchen, desperate to escape the relentless interrogation. In his blind panic to break eye contact and get out of the room, he made a fatal error. He left his thick leather clipboard sitting flat on the kitchen island. I waited until I heard the bathroom door click shut and the lock slide into place. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I stepped forward and flipped the heavy leather cover of the clipboard open. My eyes locked onto the top document. It bore no corporate bank logo. It contained no appraisal metrics or property valuation grids. It was a dense multi-page legal contract. I read the bold print stamped at the very top of the page. It was an expedited commercial estate liquidation agreement. The designated buyer was a massive regional property development corporation, widely known for bulldozing residential lots to build cheap commercial strip malls. The designated seller was Gavin, acting as the sole legal executor of the estate under an activated medical proxy. The equity loan Stephen had uncovered was nothing but a calculated smokescreen. Gavin was never planning to just borrow money against the house to save his failing security firm. He was planning to completely eradicate my legacy. He had already negotiated a rapid cash payout with a corporate developer to sell the land for a fraction of its true value. Gavin wanted instant liquid cash, and he was willing to let a bulldozer tear down the home where he grew up to get it. I scanned the execution dates printed at the bottom of the contract. The sale was legally scheduled to finalize the exact second my committal to Sunny Meadows was processed by the county court. Gavin needed me locked inside that high-security memory care ward and declared legally incompetent by Wednesday morning so he could trigger the immediate demolition of my property by Wednesday afternoon. The sound of the toilet flushing echoed down the hallway. I gently closed the leather cover of the clipboard, leaving it perfectly aligned exactly where Mark had dropped it. I stepped back and picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow sip of the bitter black liquid. The shock of the betrayal was entirely gone. In its place, a state of absolute glacial resolve settled over my mind. Mark walked back into the kitchen, looking slightly more composed after splashing water on his face. He grabbed his clipboard and forced a weak, trembling smile. He told me he had all the preliminary information he needed and would let Gavin know the property was in excellent shape. I nodded, offering a polite, gentle farewell. I stood in the foyer and watched the young fraud walk out the front door and practically run to his silver sedan. I locked the door again and stood alone in the silent house. The financial stranglehold at the bank and the forced committal were just mechanisms to facilitate the ultimate theft. Gavin was going to erase my entire history the moment they locked the padded door behind me. I knew then that simply protecting my assets was no longer enough. I had to ensure my trap was utterly inescapable. The sun had barely crested the frozen horizon on Tuesday morning when the heavy deadbolt on my front door turned with a sharp metallic click. I sat in my usual leather chair, waiting in the exact same position I had maintained since the fake appraiser left my property the day before. The house was dead quiet. I listened to the heavy boots wiping off the snow on the welcome mat. Gavin stepped into the foyer, and he was not alone. A man in a wrinkled tan suit followed him inside, carrying a thick medical briefcase. Gavin walked into the living room, rubbing his hands together to ward off the chill. He looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. "Dad." "This is Dr. Sterling," Gavin said, keeping his voice low and soothing, as if he were trying to calm a frightened animal. "He is here to check on you and make sure you are doing okay after everything that happened this weekend." I looked at the man standing next to my son. Dr. Sterling did not possess the calm, reassuring presence of a legitimate medical professional. His suit was cheap and poorly tailored. His eyes darted around my living room, taking in the expensive antique furniture and the vaulted ceilings with hungry calculation. He did not introduce himself properly. He did not offer a handshake or a medical identification card. He simply pulled a plastic pen from his breast pocket and clicked it twice. "Hello, Howard," the doctor said, adopting a tone so intensely patronizing it made my skin crawl. "Gavin tells me you have been having a very hard time lately. He says you have been confused and forgetting things. We just want to ask you a few simple questions to see how your brain is working today." I kept my hands resting flat on the armrests of my chair. I did not blink. I told him to go ahead and ask whatever he needed to ask. Sterling clicked his pen again and looked down at a form attached to his clipboard. "Can you tell me what year it is, Howard?" he asked, speaking incredibly slowly. "Do you know who the current president is? Can you tell me what you had for breakfast this morning?" The questions were designed to be insulting. They were the standard baseline queries used for patients suffering from severe advanced neurological decay. I answered each one with perfect, flat precision. I gave him the exact date the current political administration and a detailed recounting of the black coffee and dry toast I consumed an hour ago. Sterling frowned slightly. He clearly expected me to stumble or hesitate. He glanced at Gavin, who was standing by the fireplace, pretending to look at a bookshelf, while subtly pointing the camera lens of his cell phone directly at my face. Gavin was recording the entire interaction. They needed video evidence of an aggressive dementia episode to justify forcing me into the lockdown facility tomorrow. Sterling took a step closer, invading my physical space. He lowered his clipboard and locked his eyes onto mine, trying to project authority. "Howard, let us talk about Sunday morning," he said, his voice dropping into a harsh, accusatory register. "Gavin found you sitting in the dark with the main gas valve wide open. You could have killed yourself and leveled this entire neighborhood. Why did you do that, Howard? Were you trying to hurt your family?" The trap was blatantly obvious. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to deny it, to jump out of my chair and accuse Gavin of breaking in and trying to murder me. If I raised my voice and pointed fingers, Gavin would capture a perfectly framed video of a paranoid, unstable old man suffering from violent delusions. That single video file would guarantee a judge would sign off on an emergency mental incompetency order, stripping me of my rights forever. Every raw human instinct inside me screamed to stand up and break the plastic pen right out of the fake doctor hand. I wanted to roar the truth until the windows rattled. But the cold mechanical discipline I forged decades ago took absolute control. When I was in my early 30s, I managed a massive commercial construction project that faced a crippling union strike. I spent 14 consecutive days locked inside a cramped, sweltering conference room, sitting across the table from furious union representatives and greedy corporate executives. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and screaming matches. Men threw chairs and pounded their fists on the table, demanding concessions. During those grueling 2 weeks, I learned the most valuable lesson of my professional life. The first man to raise his voice loses control of the room. True power does not scream. True power sits in absolute silence and watches the opposition exhaust themselves. I applied that exact same ruthless patience now. I let Sterling accusatory questions hang in the freezing air of my living room. I did not flinch. I did not raise my heart rate. I simply looked at him with an expression of mild, polite confusion. "I do not remember touching any gas valve, doctor," I said, my voice soft and perfectly even. My memory is a bit hazy about that morning. I think I was just very tired. Sterling let out a loud, frustrated breath. He was failing his assigned task. He could not agitate me no matter how aggressively he pushed. He turned his body, slightly shifting his weight to try a different angle of attack. When he moved, a ray of cold morning sunlight caught the top corner of the paperwork clipped to his board. I focused my eyes on the illuminated paper. There was a crest printed at the top margin. It was not the logo of the regional hospital network or any respectable gerontology practice in the state. It was the stylized emblem of the Apex Wellness Clinic. The puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. The Apex Wellness Clinic was a notoriously corrupt private practice located in a strip mall 3 towns over. It was a known cash for diagnosis operation. They catered to wealthy families desperate to secure quick legal documentation for shady insurance claims and contested wills. A legitimate doctor would require brain scans, blood panels, and weeks of psychological evaluations to declare a man legally incompetent. Gavin did not have weeks. He had hours. He had paid this charlatan under the table to bypass every legal medical protocol and rubber stamp my committal papers on the spot. Sterling realized he was not going to get the violent outburst he was paid to provoke. He looked at Gavin and gave a tight, imperceptible shake of his head. The video trap had failed, but the corporate sale of my estate was still scheduled for tomorrow. They had to ensure I was physically removed from the premises before the bank deadline. Sterling pulled a specialized blue medical pad from his briefcase. He did not speak to me. He treated me as if I were a piece of broken furniture, taking up space in the room. He walked over to Gavin and began writing rapidly on the blue paper. His dementia is highly advanced, and he is displaying deep, apathetic disassociation. Sterling told my son, speaking entirely in clinical falsehoods. He is completely detached from reality. He is going to be a severe flight risk when the medical transport team arrives to take him to Sunny Meadows tomorrow morning. We cannot risk him becoming combative or trying to run away. Sterling ripped the blue paper from the pad and handed it directly to Gavin. I am prescribing a very heavy course of chemical sedatives, Sterling said, his tone cold and transactional. Go to the pharmacy and fill this immediately. I want you to crush 3 of these pills into his dinner tonight and give him another 2 in his water tomorrow morning. He needs to be completely docile and chemically restrained when the transport team walks through that door. Do not let him realize he is being medicated. Gavin took the prescription and folded it, slipping it into his coat pocket. He looked at me with an expression of triumphant malice. Thank you, Dr. Gavin said. I will make sure he takes every single pill. We just want him to be safe and calm when he goes to his new home. They walked toward the front door, their boots clicking against the hardwood floor. They did not say goodbye. They did not look back. Gavin pulled the heavy oak door shut behind them, and the deadbolt locked with a heavy thud. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the engine of their vehicle start and fade away down the street. They believed they had executed a flawless sequence of events. They had isolated me from my neighbors, cut off my financial access, prepared a fraudulent medical committal, and obtained heavy narcotics to turn my mind to mush. They were planning to drug me into a walking coma tonight and drag me out of my home tomorrow. I stood up from my leather chair. My muscles were stiff from holding the facade, but my mind was a blazing furnace of absolute clarity. Gavin thought he was a master strategist manipulating a broken old man. He did not realize he was just a careless amateur walking blindly into a blast zone. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my truck keys. I had an appointment with Stephen, and I was going to execute a financial maneuver so devastating my son would never recover. The time for pretending was officially over. The heavy steel deadbolt on the rear utility door slid back with a dull metallic scrape. I did not use the front entrance. I knew Gavin would be monitoring the street, waiting to see if his prescribed sedatives had taken effect. I stepped out into the freezing shadows of my backyard. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind cut straight through my heavy wool coat, but I barely felt the cold. The rage that had been simmering inside me was gone, replaced by absolute structural precision. I pushed my way through the dense frozen brush marking the property line. The thorns scratched my face and snagged on my clothing. I kept my eyes fixed on the gray smoke rising from the chimney of the house next door. Leon had lived beside me for over 2 decades. Rachel had proudly declared her attempt to poison his mind against me just hours ago. She wanted to isolate me entirely. I stepped onto his wooden back porch and knocked twice on the frozen glass door. Leon appeared a moment later wearing a thick knit sweater and holding a steaming mug of coffee. He pulled the door open and stared at me. He did not look at me with the pity or the fear Rachel had tried to plant in his head. I did not give him the chance to ask any questions. I looked my old friend directly in his eyes. I told Leon my son was trying to steal my home and lock me in a psychiatric ward, and I needed his car immediately to stop him. Leon stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds. He did not see a confused old man suffering from violent dementia delusions. He saw the man who had dragged him out of a flooded basement during the massive spring storms 10 years ago. He set his coffee mug on the counter and reached deep into his pocket. He pulled out a set of keys and placed them firmly in my hand. He did not ask for an explanation. He simply told me the gas tank was full and to bring it back when the job was done. I took the keys and walked around to his driveway. I climbed into his old sedan and started the engine. I navigated the icy back roads, staying completely away from the main commercial avenues where Gavin might be lurking. I drove to a nondescript brick office building on the industrial edge of the city. Stephen was already waiting for me inside a sterile ground-floor conference room. A private notary sat quietly at the far end of the long wooden table. The table was completely covered in thick stacks of legal documents. Stephen did not waste time with pleasantries. He slid the first heavy stack across the polished wood. He explained that this was the irrevocable blind trust. By signing these pages, I was legally transferring the absolute ownership of my entire estate, my liquid cash, and all my physical properties into a corporate holding company. The holding company would be controlled entirely by the trust. My personal signature would become legally worthless to any bank or commercial lender. I picked up the heavy brass pen. I did not hesitate. I signed my name on the thick paper with perfect, steady strokes. I felt a profound sense of liberation as the ink dried on the final page. I was voluntarily stripping myself of the empire I had spent 40 years building to ensure the enemy could never claim it. Stephen slid the final document forward. It was the absolute beneficiary designation form. He told me I needed to legally direct where the assets would go when I eventually passed away. I looked at the blank line. I did not write the name of my son. I wrote down the exact legal title of a state charity dedicated to housing and educating abandoned children trapped within the foster care system. Stephen paused and looked at me, but he did not utter a single word of protest. I stared at the name of the charity, and the memories of my own brutal youth flooded my mind. I remembered the freezing concrete floors of the state-run group homes. I remembered being 15 years old and sleeping with my boots tied to my feet, because the older boys would steal them in the darkness. I survived a ruthless, unforgiving childhood through sheer physical violence and relentless determination. When Gavin was born, I swore he would never know that kind of terror. I built a fortress of wealth to shield him from the agonizing realities of the world. I gave him the soft, pampered existence I had always craved. But sitting in that sterile conference room, I realized my desperate protection had been a fatal error. I had shielded him from hardship, but I had also shielded him from developing a soul. I had created a predator who viewed my unconditional sacrifice as weakness. The wealth I bled for would now serve children who understood exactly what it meant to survive in the cold. The private notary stamped the final page, gathered his equipment, and walked out of the room without making a sound. The financial perimeter was completely secure. Gavin could drag me to the bank and force a pen into my hand, but the documents he signed would be legally void. But Stephen did not look triumphant. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He told me the trust protected my money, but it did not protect my physical body. The legal maneuver we just executed was entirely defensive. Stephen explained that Gavin still possessed the forged medical proxy and the fraudulent narcotic prescriptions from that corrupt clinic. If Gavin managed to drug me tonight and force me into that medical transport van tomorrow morning, the situation would become a disaster. Stephen warned me that once the heavy doors of a high-security memory care ward locked behind me, extracting me legally would take months. Gavin would use my chemically sedated state as absolute proof of my supposed advanced dementia. He would exhaust my remaining personal funds fighting Stephen in probate court while I sat strapped to a bed staring blindly at a white wall. The holding company would save my house, but I would lose my mind. A quiet legal victory was no longer enough. If I simply ran away and checked into a motel, Gavin would immediately file a missing persons report. He would trigger a statewide alert, painting me as a dangerously confused elder wandering the frozen streets. The police would hunt me down and deliver me directly back into his custody. I realized I could not run, and I could not fight him behind closed doors. I had to let him spring his trap. I had to let him bring the transport team and the chemical restraints directly into my living room. I needed to break my son publicly in front of the exact authorities he was trying to weaponize against me. I needed to orchestrate a confrontation so catastrophic that his carefully constructed mask would shatter for the whole world to see. I stood up from the conference table and pushed the brass pen back toward Stephen. I told him to keep his phone on him tomorrow morning and be ready to move when I gave the signal. I walked out of the brutalist office building and climbed back into Leon Old Sedan. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the snow. I had to get back to my house and swallow the poison my son was bringing me. I parked Leon Old Sedan 2 streets over from my house and walked the rest of the way, slipping through the dense line of pine trees that bordered my backyard. The frozen crust of snow crunched softly under my boots. I moved with deliberate care, staying low behind the tall privacy fence until I reached the back patio. The temporary plywood repair Gavin hired man had slapped over the shattered glass offered no real security. I slipped inside without making a sound and locked the deadbolt. The house was completely silent, but a heavy, unfamiliar warmth radiated from the kitchen. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed hallway, listening. The rhythmic chopping of a knife against a wooden cutting board echoed down the corridor, followed by the sizzle of butter hitting a hot pan. The scent of roasted garlic and simmering beef broth drifted toward me. It was a rich, savory smell that instantly triggered a vivid memory from 12 years ago. Rachel had been a nervous 22-year-old, desperate to impress me during her first Thanksgiving with our family. She had asked me to teach her how to make Diane's famous beef stew. I had stood in that exact same kitchen guiding her hands as she chopped the vegetables, showing her the precise moment to add the garlic so it would not burn. I had thought we were building a foundation for a new daughter. Now she was standing at my stove using the very recipe I taught her to mask the chemical taste of my imprisonment. I crept silently down the hallway, pressing my back against the wall until I reached the cracked opening of the kitchen door. Rachel was standing at the granite island, humming a tuneless melody under her breath. She wore a pristine white apron over her expensive cashmere sweater. 2 steaming bowls of dark, rich stew sat on the counter. I watched her through the narrow gap in the doorframe. She stopped humming and reached into the deep pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small plastic prescription bottle. It was the exact bottle Gavin had secured from that corrupt clinic doctor just hours ago. She twisted the child-proof cap off and spilled 3 thick white pills onto the cutting board. She did not hesitate. She picked up the heavy flat side of a meat tenderizer and brought it down hard, crushing the pills into a fine, chalky powder. Rachel swept the white dust off the board with the edge of her knife and scraped it directly into my bowl of stew. She picked up a silver spoon and stirred it vigorously, making sure the heavy narcotics dissolved completely into the thick broth. Then she wiped down the counter, rinsed the cutting board, and threw the empty plastic bottle into the trash. She had executed the poisoning with the casual, mundane efficiency of a woman adding salt to a recipe. I stepped backward into the shadows of the hallway and let out a loud, deliberate cough. Rachel froze. I stomped my boots against the hardwood floor, mimicking the heavy, dragging footsteps of an exhausted old man entering the house through the front door. I walked into the kitchen, letting my shoulders sag and my eyes droop. Rachel immediately spun around, painting on a mask of radiant, artificial warmth. "Howard," she said, her voice dripping with forced cheer. "I did not hear you come in. I took the liberty of letting myself in. I knew you must be freezing and hungry after wandering around town, so I made your absolute favorite." I looked at the steaming bowl she pushed across the island toward me. The aroma of roasted garlic completely hid the chemical reality of what she had just stirred into it. I gave her a weak, trembling smile. "That is very kind of you, Rachel," I said, keeping my voice low and fragile. I am just so tired. I sat down heavily on a wooden bar stool directly in front of the poisoned bowl. Rachel sat across from me, sipping from her own untainted portion. She watched me with intense, unblinking focus. She needed visual confirmation that I was consuming the drugs. She needed to see the chemical submission take hold. I picked up my spoon and dipped it into the thick broth. I raised it halfway to my mouth and stopped. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a harsh, ragged cough. I doubled over, hacking violently against my fist, letting my breathing hitch and gasp. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, acting as if I could not catch my breath. Rachel stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Howard, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tightening with sudden panic. She was not worried about my health. She was terrified that a sudden medical emergency might derail the carefully timed committal process scheduled for tomorrow morning. I wheezed heavily, pointing a trembling finger toward the refrigerator. "Water," I gasped out, forcing my voice to crack. "Please, Rachel, a glass of cold water." Rachel turned her back to me and rushed toward the refrigerator, yanking open the heavy stainless steel door. The second her line of sight was broken, my trembling hands moved with blinding speed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thick, gallon-sized plastic Ziploc bag I had prepared at Stephen's office. I held it below the lip of the counter and dumped the entire contents of the poisoned bowl straight into the plastic bag. I sealed it silently and shoved the heavy, sloshing bag deep into the interior pocket of my heavy wool coat. I wiped the bowl clean with a paper napkin and threw the napkin into my pocket right beside the bag. Then I picked up my spoon and scraped it loudly against the empty ceramic bowl. Rachel turned back around, holding a glass of ice water. She looked down at my perfectly clean bowl, and her eyes widened in profound relief. She handed me the water and watched as I took a long, slow drink. "Wow, you must have been starving," she said, her voice returning to its sickly sweet cadence. I nodded slowly, letting my chin drop toward my chest. "I think I ate it too fast," I mumbled, slurring my words slightly. "I feel very heavy, Rachel." I let my eyelids droop completely shut. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the island, and let my head loll against my forearms. I slowed my breathing to a deep, rhythmic drawl, simulating the immediate, overwhelming onset of heavy commercial narcotics. I relaxed every muscle in my body, slumping completely over the counter, like a marionette with its strings cut. Rachel did not ask if I was okay. She did not try to help me up. She stood perfectly still, watching my chest rise and fall. She waited a full 60 seconds to ensure the chemical sedation was absolute. When I did not move, I heard the distinct rustle of fabric as she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her cell phone. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the rapid tapping of her fingernails against the glass screen. She was typing a message. I kept my eyes shut, but my hearing was hyper-focused. I heard the soft, electronic swoosh as the text message was sent. "He is out," she whispered to herself, her voice entirely stripped of its artificial warmth, leaving only cold, clinical triumph. I heard her footsteps move away from the island. She walked into the hallway, and I heard the faint click of her dialing a number. "Gavin," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The doctor prescription worked perfectly. He is completely under. He is practically comatose. Bring the final transport papers over right now. We do not need to wait until tomorrow morning. We can move him tonight while it is dark and nobody is watching." I remained slumped over the granite island, my face pressed against the cold stone. They were accelerating the timeline. The trap was closing hours earlier than they had planned, but they did not know that the man they thought they were trapping was entirely wide awake and holding the very evidence that would destroy them both. The final act was about to begin. The cold stone of the kitchen island pressed hard against the side of my face. I kept my eyes closed, letting my arms hang completely limp toward the floor. I forced my muscles to go entirely slack, surrendering all physical tension in my neck and back. To the untrained eye, I was completely incapacitated. I was a frail, confused old man who had finally succumbed to a massive dose of chemical sedatives. But beneath that carefully constructed physical illusion, my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I listened to the sharp rhythmic clicking of Rachel's designer heels against the hardwood floors. She walked out of the kitchen and headed straight down the hallway. She was not looking for a blanket to cover me. She was not searching for a telephone to check on the medical transport team Gavin had scheduled for the morning. She was heading directly for the master bedroom. The heavy oak door to my bedroom creaked open. I heard the distinct aggressive sound of dresser drawers being yanked out and pushed back in. Then came the soft metallic clinking of a heavy brass latch. She had found Diane's antique jewelry box. I lay perfectly still on the kitchen counter, listening to the absolute violation of my late wife's sacred possessions. Rachel walked back into the living area. I could hear the heavy wooden box hit the glass surface of the coffee table. She let out a long breath of pure, unrestrained satisfaction. It was the sound of a predator admiring a fresh kill. "I am taking these," she said aloud to the empty room. Her voice carried no trace of the fake saccharine sweetness she used when Gavin was around. It was harsh and vibrating, with naked, unfiltered greed. She was talking to herself, but she wanted the comatose old man in the kitchen to hear her. She wanted to gloat over her absolute victory. I heard the clatter of heavy gold and silver chains being pulled from the velvet-lined compartments. She was sifting through 30 years of anniversaries and birthdays. She found the sapphire pendant I had given Diane for our 20th anniversary. I heard the sharp intake of breath as she held it up to the light. "You never deserved any of this," Rachel muttered, the sound of her sorting through the diamonds echoing through the silent house. "You and your pathetic, dusty little life, sitting in this massive house while Gavin and I drown in debt. It is completely unfair. We are the ones who have a future. We are the ones who know how to live." She dropped a handful of heavy rings into her leather purse. The brazen theft of the heirloom jewelry was just a prelude to her ultimate prize. "I hope they keep you heavily medicated in that facility," she continued, her heels clicking as she paced back and forth across the living room rug. "Gavin feels guilty, but he is weak. He does not understand what it takes to survive in the real world. By tomorrow afternoon, this entire property will belong to the commercial developers. They are bringing the bulldozers next month. They are going to wipe this miserable monument to your dead wife right off the map." Her words were designed to be a final psychological stake through my heart. She was tearing down my entire history and selling the rubble to fund her vanity. She laughed softly, a dry, cruel sound that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. "I am going to buy a beautiful new house in the hills," she whispered. "I am going to completely forget you ever existed, Howard." The clicking of her heels suddenly changed direction. She was walking back toward the kitchen. She was coming to check her handiwork. I kept my face pressed tightly against the granite. I heard her stop right next to my stool. The overwhelming scent of her thick floral perfume washed over me completely, suffocating the lingering smell of the spilled beef stew. She stood over me for a long, terrifying moment. Then I felt her cold, manicured fingers press against the side of my neck. She was checking my pulse. She needed to ensure the heavy narcotics she had crushed into my food had not stopped my heart entirely. A dead body in the kitchen would trigger a mandatory police investigation and an autopsy which would instantly reveal the massive overdose of illegal sedatives. She needed me alive just long enough to sign those final commercial bank documents tomorrow morning. When her fingers pressed into my carotid artery, my body wanted to react. The natural human instinct when touched by an enemy is to flinch, to pull away, to let the heart rate spike in a sudden rush of adrenaline. But I was not just a retired commercial contractor. Long before I poured concrete or managed hostile union negotiations, I was a young infantryman drafted into a brutal, unforgiving jungle war. I remembered lying motionless in the deep mud of a suffocating rainforest, with enemy patrols walking less than 10 feet away. During those agonizing hours in the dark, any sudden movement meant instant death. I learned how to separate my mind from my physical body. I learned how to breathe so shallowly that my chest did not even rise. I learned a specialized tactical breathing technique to manually depress my own heart rate, slowing the blood pumping through my veins to a sluggish crawl. I pulled that decades-old discipline from the absolute depths of my memory and applied it perfectly. I focused entirely on the black void behind my closed eyelids. I exhaled the remaining air from my lungs and let my heartbeat drop into a slow, steady thud. Rachel pressed her fingers deeper into my neck, searching for the rhythm. I gave her nothing but the slow, lethargic pulse of a heavily sedated invalid. She pulled her hand away. I heard her let out a quiet sigh of relief. "He is completely out," she whispered to herself. She turned around and walked back into the living room to finish looting my wife's jewelry box. She was utterly convinced of her own supremacy. She believed she had executed a flawless sequence of manipulation, theft, and poisoning. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, leaving no trace of her crimes behind. But Rachel was operating completely blind. She did not know that 3 hours earlier, while she and Gavin were busy finalizing their fraudulent legal paperwork, I had not been wandering aimlessly. I had been working with Leon. When I borrowed Leon's car to execute the blind trust with Stephen, I had also asked my old neighbor for a massive tactical favor. Leon was a retired security technician. He spent his entire professional career wiring commercial bank vaults and securing government buildings. When I returned from Stephen's office, Leon slipped through my back door, carrying a heavy black duffel bag filled with professional-grade surveillance equipment. While Gavin and Rachel were plotting my demise, Leon and I were silently tearing apart my living room and kitchen. We worked with the rapid, flawless precision of men who understood the exact stakes of the game. Leon had installed 3 separate high-definition micro cameras. He wired the first one directly inside the plastic casing of the kitchen smoke detector, positioning the wide-angle lens to look straight down at the granite island. He embedded the second camera inside the thick spine of a hollowed-out encyclopedia on my living room bookshelf, giving it a perfect, unobstructed view of the coffee table. He mounted the third camera high up in the corner molding of the ceiling, capturing the entire open floor plan in a single sweeping shot. These were not cheap commercial cameras that recorded to a vulnerable local hard drive. Leon had utilized military-grade optics, capturing every single frame in pristine 4,000-pixel resolution. Furthermore, he had linked the entire network to an encrypted cloud server, utilizing an invisible cellular uplink. The video files were transmitting instantly and permanently to a secure digital vault that Stephen controlled remotely from his law office downtown. Rachel did not know that the tiny black dot in the smoke detector above her head had recorded the exact moment she crushed those illegal sedatives and swept the toxic powder into my soup. The lens captured the label on the prescription bottle, her deliberate stirring, and her cold, calculated expression as she prepared the poison. She did not know that the camera hidden in the bookshelf was currently broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-definition feed of her stuffing my late wife diamond earrings and sapphire pendants into her designer purse. Most devastating of all, she did not realize that Leon had placed highly sensitive omnidirectional microphones inside the baseboards. Every single word of her cruel, arrogant monologue was being permanently archived. The cloud server was currently storing pristine audio of her confessing to the impending estate sale to the commercial developers. It recorded her explicit admission that she was planning to bulldoze my home and use my tragic medical committal to fund her new life in the hills. She had willingly handed me the absolute weapon of her own destruction. I lay perfectly still on the kitchen counter, listening to the final metallic click of the antique jewelry box closing. I heard Rachel zip her heavy leather purse shut, trapping the stolen heirlooms inside. She walked back into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply one last time. She did not bother to look at me again. She simply grabbed her winter coat and walked out the front door, locking it firmly behind her. The moment the sound of her engine faded down the frozen street, I opened my eyes. I sat up, slowly rolling my shoulders and stretching the stiff muscles in my neck. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy plastic bag filled with the poisoned soup. It was the physical evidence needed to seal the criminal tampering charge. I looked up at the smoke detector. and gave a single slow nod to the hidden lens. Stephen was watching the live feed from his office. He had the video of the poisoning. He had the audio of the corporate real estate conspiracy. He had the high-definition footage of the grand larceny. Gavin and Rachel believed they were arriving tomorrow morning to drag a drugged, helpless old man out of his house and strip him of his life. They had no idea that they were walking straight into a legal and financial slaughterhouse. The trap was armed, the evidence was secured, and I was ready to bring my son empire crashing down around his ears. The cold, ambient light of early Wednesday morning crept across the hardwood floor of the living room. I remained entirely motionless, draped heavily across the arm of the sofa, where I had relocated myself during the deep hours of the night. I had carefully adjusted my posture to mimic the exact structural collapse of a human body, surrendering to a massive overdose of chemical sedatives. My breathing was deliberately shallow, drawing only enough oxygen to keep my blood moving. The house was a tomb of absolute silence until the low, heavy rumble of a commercial diesel engine shattered the quiet. I listened as the large vehicle idled at the curb. The heavy air brakes hissed sharply, cutting through the freezing morning air. The medical transport van had arrived exactly on schedule. I heard the familiar heavy crunch of boots on the icy gravel of the driveway. Keys jingled against the metal lock of the front door. The deadbolt slid back with a harsh finality, and the heavy oak door swung open, letting in a rush of bitter winter wind. Gavin and Rachel stepped into the foyer. They did not call out my name. They did not announce their presence with the false, cheerful tones they usually employed. The mask was completely gone now that they believed my mind was eradicated. I heard the sharp tapping of Rachel designer heels and the heavy thud of Gavin winter boots as they walked straight into the living room. "He is exactly where I left him," Rachel said, her voice flat and devoid of any human empathy. "The pills worked perfectly. He has been out cold all night." I felt their presence looming over me. The proximity of my son sent a primal warning signal through my nervous system, but I maintained my absolute physical discipline. I kept my eyes shut tight. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I forced every muscle fiber in my neck and shoulders to release their tension, making myself entirely dead weight. "We need to get this done before the transport crew comes inside," Gavin said, his voice vibrating with a frantic, greedy energy. "The bank needs these final equity loan documents signed and notarized by noon. Bring the clipboard and the blue pen. Grab his other arm and help me pull him up." I felt Rachel's cold, manicured fingers grip my left bicep. Gavin grabbed my right shoulder with a harsh, unyielding grip. They did not handle me with the care or dignity afforded to a frail elder. They hoisted me violently upward, hauling my torso off the armrest and dragging me backward onto the center cushions of the sofa. I let my head snap back and roll limply against the leather upholstery. I offered absolutely no physical assistance, forcing them to bear the entire burden of my dead weight. Gavin let out a loud, dramatic groan of exertion as he dropped my heavy frame onto the cushions. "He is like lifting a sack of wet cement," Gavin complained, bitterly panting for breath. "He has always been too heavy. He eats garbage and sits in that chair all day. I am going to throw my back out just trying to get him into the wheelchair." I sat slumped against the leather, listening to the profound resentment echoing in my son's voice. 30 years ago, when Gavin was a small, exhausted child, I used to carry him up the steep wooden stairs of our first house every single night. I would carefully lift him from the back seat of my truck, supporting his fragile neck, making sure I did not wake him from his peaceful sleep. I carried the weight of his entire world on my shoulders, without a single fraction of complaint. I worked grueling, brutal hours in the freezing mud of construction sites, just to ensure he would never know the physical agony of manual labor. Now, as he stood over me, wiping the sweat from his forehead, he did not look at a father who had sacrificed his body to build an empire. He simply looked at a heavy, inconvenient piece of garbage that needed to be hauled away to the dump. The total absence of any fundamental human love was absolute. He viewed my physical body as nothing more than a fleshy obstacle blocking his path to a massive financial payout. "Just prop him up and get it over with," Rachel hissed impatiently. "The transport guys are waiting in the freezing cold." We are paying them by the hour. Gavin grabbed the front of my wool sweater and yanked me forward. He shoved a thick, decorative throw pillow behind my shoulder blades, forcing my torso to remain somewhat upright. I let my chin rest heavily against my chest, keeping my eyes entirely hidden. I felt the cold, smooth edge of a thick leather clipboard being shoved forcefully onto my lap. The conflict was escalating to its absolute breaking point. This was the moment Gavin had planned for months. He was about to steal the accumulated wealth of my entire existence. He believed the signature he was about to forge would trigger the immediate corporate demolition of my legacy. He had no idea that Stephen had already filed the ironclad blind trust documents, rendering the papers on my lap completely legally worthless. I just needed to let him complete the crime. I needed the hidden cameras Leon installed to capture the undeniable physical act of elder exploitation. Gavin grabbed my right wrist. His skin was damp with nervous sweat. He squeezed my hand tightly, digging his fingers into my knuckles. He snatched a heavy brass pen from Rachel and wedged the thick barrel between my thumb and index finger. I had to play the physical resistance perfectly. If my hand was too rigid, Gavin would instantly know I was awake and faking the sedation. If my hand was entirely limp, the pen would simply fall to the floor, and the signature would look like an illegible scribble, raising immediate suspicion at the bank. I had to simulate the exact muscular response of a heavily drugged patient, offering just enough passive resistance to let him guide my hand, while remaining entirely pliable. Gavin leaned over me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He smelled of stale coffee and sharp, nervous adrenaline. He pressed his hand completely over mine, gripping my knuckles like a vice. He forced my arm downward, pressing the tip of the brass pen hard against the thick stack of financial documents. "Just let me guide it," Gavin muttered under his breath, speaking to himself as he manipulated my hand. "Keep the pressure steady. Make the loops look like his old signatures." He dragged my hand across the bottom margin of the paper. I felt the friction of the ballpoint rolling over the heavy stalk. He forced my fingers to trace the specific, jagged, cursive letters of my first and last name. He pressed so hard the pen nearly tore right through the physical document. He was literally stealing my identity by force, treating my hand like a mindless mechanical tool. He flipped the heavy page over and immediately dragged my hand down to the next signature line. "This one is the admission form for Sunny Meadows," he whispered, his voice trembling with dark excitement. "Once this is signed, they have complete medical custody. He cannot sign himself out, and nobody can visit him without my explicit written permission. We are locking the door and throwing away the key." He forced my hand to sign the facility admission papers, cementing his ultimate betrayal. He was legally trapping me in a high-security chemical prison. He ripped the pen out of my fingers and shoved my hand away. I let my arm fall heavily off the side of the sofa, my knuckles striking the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Gavin stepped back from the sofa, holding the thick leather clipboard up to the morning light. I listened to the heavy silence in the room as he inspected the forged signatures. He was verifying the theft, making sure the ink looked convincing enough to satisfy the corporate bank managers. He let out a sharp, sudden bark of laughter. The sound was entirely unhinged, vibrating with pure, arrogant victory. It was the laugh of a man who believed he had just conquered the world and outsmarted everyone around him. "We did it, Rachel," Gavin said, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the living room. "Look at these signatures. They are absolutely perfect. The bank will authorize the wire transfer by the end of the business day." I heard Rachel step closer to him, the rustle of her expensive coat shifting as she looked at the stolen documents. "I knew this would work," she said, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction. "I told you he was too weak to fight us. He is just a broken old man. He did not even know what hit him." Gavin smacked the clipboard triumphantly against his thigh. He waved the papers in the air, celebrating the absolute destruction of my life. "We are millionaires, Rachel," he declared, his voice ringing with pure, unfiltered greed. "The estate is entirely liquidated. The money is ours. Go open the front door and signal the transport crew. Tell them the patient is fully sedated and ready to be loaded into the van. Let us get this piece of garbage out of our house." The heavy steel door of the medical transport van slammed shut outside. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street like a gunshot, signaling the final act of Gavin's desperate play. I sat completely motionless on the leather sofa, maintaining the exact posture of a man severely compromised by heavy chemical sedation. My chin rested deeply against my sternum, and my arms hung perfectly limp at my sides. Every muscle fiber in my body was entirely relaxed, projecting the absolute illusion of physical defeat. The heavy front door of my house swung open. The bitter, freezing wind swept into the foyer, followed immediately by the chaotic shuffling of multiple heavy boots. I listened to the sounds of the invasion with absolute tactical clarity. Gavin spoke first. His voice was an auditory masterpiece of manufactured grief. He sounded broken, exhausted, and completely overwhelmed by tragic circumstances. "Please come straight through to the living room, gentlemen," Gavin said, his voice cracking flawlessly on the final word. "He has been completely unresponsive all morning. The doctor warned us the neurological decline would be rapid, but we never expected it to happen this fast. It just breaks my heart to see my father like this." I heard Rachel step forward, her expensive boots clicking sharply against the hardwood. "We are just so incredibly thankful you could come so quickly," she added, her tone dripping with false maternal concern. "We stayed up all night, terrified he would try to turn the gas on again or wander out into the snow. We simply cannot provide the intense medical supervision he requires anymore." The performance was nauseating. They were selling the narrative of the dutiful, heartbroken children surrendering their beloved patriarch to a specialized facility for his own safety. They needed these orderlies to believe they were performing an act of mercy rather than facilitating a corporate kidnapping. I heard the distinct rhythmic squeal of heavy rubber wheels rolling across the foyer tiles. The transport orderlies had brought the steel wheelchair. The metallic rattling grew louder as they pushed the heavy chair down the hallway and navigated it into the living room. The wheels stopped directly in front of the sofa. The harsh mechanical click of the wheel brakes engaging sliced through the quiet room. "I am sorry you have to deal with this, sir," a deep, unfamiliar voice rumbled. It was the lead orderly. His tone was flat and strictly professional. He was a man accustomed to hauling human cargo without asking unnecessary questions. "It is never easy handing over a family member, but you are making the right choice for his safety. Where do you need us to position him?" "He is right here," Gavin replied, letting out a long, trembling sigh. "Please just try to be gentle. He is very frail and his bones are quite brittle." As I sat there feigning total sensory collapse, a sharp, bitter memory ignited in the back of my mind. I had seen Gavin deploy this exact same psychological mask of tragic innocence before. The specific cadence of his weeping, the trembling shoulders, the flawless manipulation of authority figures, it was a performance he had perfected over 2 decades ago. I remembered a freezing rainstorm in late November. Gavin was 19 years old and had returned home after flunking his first semester of college. I received a phone call from the highway patrol at 3 in the morning. Gavin had driven my heavy-duty work truck straight into a concrete retaining wall on the interstate. When I arrived at this crash scene, the rain was coming down in blinding sheets. The front axle of my truck was completely pulverized, wrapping the engine block tightly around the concrete barrier. Gavin was sitting on the wet bumper of a police cruiser, smelling heavily of cheap alcohol. A massive veteran state trooper stood over him, holding a heavy metal flashlight, directly in Gavin's face, preparing to administer a field sobriety test. I stood in the pouring rain and watched my teenage son execute a flawless psychopathic maneuver. Gavin did not act angry or combative. He did not slur his words. He simply looked up at the towering state trooper and began to violently sob. He manufactured thick, desperate tears, letting his entire body shake with fabricated trauma. Gavin told the officer he had been swerving wildly to avoid a stray dog. He claimed he was so utterly consumed by anxiety over his mother's failing health that he had suffered a massive, crippling panic attack behind the wheel. Diane was in perfect physical health at the time, but Gavin used her name as a human shield, without a single fraction of hesitation or remorse. He cried with such absolute terrifying conviction that the hardened state trooper actually lowered his flashlight and placed a sympathetic hand on Gavin's shoulder. The officer did not issue a breathalyzer. He did not write a citation for driving under the influence. He simply wrote a minor warning for reckless driving due to hazardous weather and told me to take my deeply traumatized son home. When I drove Gavin away from the wreckage that night, his tears vanished the exact second my car doors locked. He slouched against the passenger seat and let out a dry, arrogant laugh. He boasted about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate the police. He bragged about his ability to cry on command. Sitting in the dark vehicle, listening to his cold laughter, I realized I was entirely responsible for building a predator. I had spent my entire life shielding him from the harsh consequences of reality, and he had learned how to weaponize human empathy for his own selfish survival. Now, 20 years later, he was utilizing that exact same psychopathic ease to permanently erase me from his life. The monster had never changed. He had simply found a more profitable target. The lead orderly let out a heavy breath. He looks completely under the man noted observing my slumped posture. Are you certain he is medically safe to transport without chemical restraints? We gave him the exact dosage the clinic doctor prescribed. Rachel interjected quickly, defending their fraudulent medication protocol. He is very docile when the sedatives take effect. You just need to lift him securely under the arms. Once he is strapped into the chair, he will not put up any resistance. I heard the heavy rustle of thick canvas fabric as the orderly stepped directly into my personal space. The harsh scent of sterile alcohol wipes and stale coffee washed over me. I felt the heat of the man's large hand reaching down toward my right shoulder. Gavin stood just a few feet away, completely holding his breath. I could feel the intense vibrating anticipation radiating from his body. He believed he was seconds away from total, absolute victory. He thought his forged bank signatures had secured the massive equity loan. He thought the fake medical proxy had guaranteed my permanent institutional imprisonment. He truly believed he had successfully stolen my entire existence. The orderly's heavy hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder, preparing to haul my dead weight upward. I did not flinch. I did not gasp for air. I executed a deliberate, absolute shift in my physical energy. I opened my eyes. I did not blink groggily at the morning light. I did not look around the room with the vacant, glassy stare of a heavily medicated victim. I locked my eyes directly onto the lead orderly, staring straight through him with glacial, absolute clarity. The orderly immediately froze. His fingers loosened their grip on my wool sweater. He instantly recognized that the man sitting on the sofa was not suffering from advanced chemical sedation or neurological decay. The dead weight completely vanished from my posture. I engaged my core muscles and sat up perfectly straight, aligning my spine rigidly against the backrest of the sofa. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I reached up with my right hand and calmly adjusted the collar of my shirt, smoothing out the wrinkled fabric. I brushed a small piece of lint off my knee. I placed both of my hands flat against my thighs, keeping my fingers perfectly still. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. I sat with the rigid, imposing authority of a corporate chairman presiding over a hostile boardroom. I will not be needing the chair, gentlemen, I said. My voice did not slur. It did not crack or waver with advanced age. I projected the words from deep within my chest, letting them cut through the silence of the living room like a heavy steel blade. The absolute, undeniable authority in my tone echoed sharply off the hardwood floors. The lead orderly snatched his hand away from my shoulder and took a rapid, stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over the metal footrests of the wheelchair. He looked at me in total shock and then turned to glare intensely at Gavin. The carefully constructed narrative of the frail, comatose dementia patient had completely evaporated in a single devastating second. Gavin completely stopped breathing. The fake, tragic tears dried instantly on his face. The mask of the grieving son was violently ripped away, leaving behind a portrait of absolute, unadulterated panic. His eyes widened to the size of coins, staring at me, as if I had just risen directly from the grave. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. No sound emerged. He was entirely paralyzed, trapped in the terrifying realization that his chemical attack had spectacularly failed. Rachel dropped her designer purse directly onto the floor. The heavy leather slapped against the wood, but nobody moved to retrieve it. She stared at me, her jaw hanging open, the blood completely draining from her face. The arrogant, victorious woman who had gleefully looted my wife's jewelry box an hour ago was instantly replaced by a terrified animal caught in an inescapable trap. I remained perfectly seated on the sofa. The hidden cameras mounted above the bookshelf and inside the smoke detector were silently recording every single fraction of their horror. Stephen was sitting in his downtown office watching the live high-definition feed, waiting for my final command. The holding company owned the house. The charity owned the estate. The poison was securely sealed in a plastic bag inside my coat pocket. I looked directly into my son's panicked eyes. The silent reckoning was complete. The war he had waged in the shadows was over, and the absolute public destruction of his entire life had officially begun. I looked at the lead orderly and kept my posture perfectly rigid against the leather cushions. I told him to take his men and wait outside on the frozen front lawn. I kept my voice flat and completely stripped of any underlying emotion. I informed the men that they had been hired under entirely fraudulent pretenses by a desperate amateur attempting to commit a massive felony. The orderly hesitated, shifting his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. He looked from my clear, unblinking eyes to the sweating, panicked face of my son. The medical transport crew was highly trained to handle combative dementia patients who thrashed and screamed. They were absolutely not equipped to handle a lucid corporate executive issuing calm legal warnings from a living room sofa. The lead orderly took a long, slow step backward away from the coffee table. He signaled his partner with a quick jerk of his chin, and they both retreated toward the foyer. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the dark, catastrophic family collapse unfolding in front of them. The heavy front door clicked shut, leaving us completely alone in the house. Gavin let out a strangled, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He could not let the transport team leave the property. If I did not get into the back of that medical van, his entire operational timeline would shatter into a million jagged pieces. The commercial estate sale he had brokered would fail immediately. The corporate bank would aggressively demand their money back. He lunged forward and grabbed me violently by the shoulders. His hands were shaking with such intensity that I could feel the vibrations traveling down through my heavy wool sweater. He dug his fingers into my collarbone and tried to physically drag my body off the sofa. He wanted to force me toward the steel wheelchair by sheer brute strength. He was panting heavily, muttering breathless, desperate curses under his breath. He ordered me to stand up. He demanded that I stop ruining his life. He was no longer trying to play the tragic weeping son, handing over his beloved father. The mask had completely melted away, leaving a cornered feral animal fighting blindly for its own survival. I did not throw a punch to defend myself. I did not strike him or attempt to push him away. I simply planted my heavy boots firmly against the hardwood floor and locked my core abdominal muscles. I anchored my weight deep into the structure of the sofa. Gavin was 30 years younger than me, but he had spent his entire adult life sitting comfortably behind a sleek office desk. He possessed absolutely no functional physical strength. He yanked and pulled at my clothing, but he could not move my center of gravity a single inch. I sat like a massive block of solid granite, watching the greasy sweat pour down his flushed, red face. Rachel stood frozen near the brick fireplace, clutching her designer purse tightly against her chest. She was entirely unable to comprehend how their flawless covert operation had so violently derailed in a matter of seconds. Gavin pulled back his right fist, preparing to strike me directly across the face in a moment of sheer blind frustration. Before his muscles could snap forward, the heavy oak door in the foyer swung open with a massive, deafening crash. The sound of heavy tactical boots echoed rapidly down the corridor. Stephen walked straight into the center of the living room. He did not look like a friendly neighborhood lawyer dropping by for a casual morning visit. His face was a mask of absolute legal hostility. He was not alone in the house. Two tall men in dark tactical windbreakers followed closely behind him, spreading out to secure the perimeter of the room. They wore heavy silver badges clipped to their belts, identifying them as state fraud investigators. Detective Miller, a veteran precinct investigator I had known for over 15 years, walked in right behind them. He placed his hand casually over the radio attached to his utility belt and scanned the room with cold, calculating eyes. Gavin dropped his hands and stumbled backward, entirely paralyzed by the sudden influx of heavy law enforcement. The air in the room grew incredibly dense and suffocating. The physical imposing presence of the detectives completely crushed the remaining oxygen out of Gavin and Rachel. They were entirely trapped, with nowhere left to run. I turned my head and looked directly at Rachel. Her eyes were darting frantically toward the hallway, but Detective Miller was physically blocking the only exit. I spoke to her, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. I told her the beef stew she made for me last night was an excellent culinary attempt. I complimented her technique, telling her she had crushed the heavy sedatives flawlessly into the thick broth. Rachel went completely pale. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her jaw trembled violently, but her vocal cords could not produce a single sound. I reminded her about the day she first joined our family. I told the quiet room how I had stood in that exact same kitchen 12 years ago, patiently teaching her how to simmer the garlic and prepare that specific recipe. She had taken a warm family memory and weaponized it, turning my own kitchen into a poison laboratory. It was a deeply visceral, intimate betrayal. I explained to the silent room that I had not swallowed a single drop of her contaminated meal. I told them I had faked the coughing fit and dumped the poisoned soup directly into a plastic Ziploc bag hidden in my lap. Exactly 24 hours ago, I handed that exact same sealed bag to a private courier. He drove it straight to an independent toxicology laboratory in the city. The chemical results had been digitally transmitted to Detective Miller before the sun even came up this morning. The analysis officially confirmed a massive lethal dose of unprescribed commercial sedatives. I watched Rachel's legs physically give out from under her. She slumped heavily against the brick fireplace, sliding down until she hit the floor. The designer purse full of my late wife's stolen jewelry slipped from her hands and spilled open, scattering diamonds and gold chains across the living room rug. Stephen stepped forward and approached the glass coffee table. He carried a massive, thick leather folder under his right arm. He slammed it down onto the glass surface with a loud, definitive crack that made Gavin jump. Stephen looked at my son with absolute professional disgust. Stephen announced that he was officially serving them with the executed irrevocable blind trust documents. Gavin stared at the thick stack of legal papers, completely unable to process the devastating reality of the words. Stephen did not give him a moment to catch his breath. He explained the legal architecture of my masterstroke with brutal, unforgiving precision. He told Gavin that the house they were currently standing in no longer belonged to me. The property, the bank accounts, the commercial land, and all the liquid assets had been completely transferred to a corporate holding company 24 hours ago. I did not own a single fraction of the estate anymore. The sole legal beneficiary of the entire holding company was a state charity dedicated to housing and educating abandoned foster children. I had shielded Gavin from the harsh realities of the foster system I endured as a child, but now those exact children would inherit the empire he tried to steal. Stephen leaned over the table and tapped a thick, manicured finger against the documents. He looked Gavin directly in his panicked eyes. He explained the fatal, unyielding trap Gavin had just willingly walked right into. The massive equity loan Gavin had illegally secured required the authentic signature of the primary property owner. Because the holding company now legally owned the house, my personal signature was officially worthless. When Gavin physically forced my limp hand to sign those final bank documents just 10 minutes ago, he did not just commit standard financial fraud. He transmitted a forged, unauthorized signature to a federally insured financial institution across state lines to secure a massive commercial payout. Gavin's knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the back of the sofa, trying to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The realization of what he had done washed over his face in a wave of absolute sickening terror. Stephen spelled the final consequences out for him so there could be no possible misunderstanding. By forcing my hand to sign that specific paper, Gavin had officially committed massive federal wire fraud. It carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The state fraud investigators stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The silent reckoning had completely fallen, and my son was finally going to face the brutal reality of the world. Stephen stepped back from the glass coffee table, letting the sheer weight of the federal wire fraud revelation crush whatever remained of Gavin's arrogant facade. The absolute silence in the living room was suffocating. Detective Miller stepped forward, pulling a small black digital tablet from his tactical windbreaker. He did not issue a verbal warning or read them their rights just yet. He walked directly to the massive flat-screen television mounted above my brick fireplace. He connected a small cable to the side of the screen and tapped the glass of his tablet. The television flared to life, casting a harsh artificial glow over the pale, terrified faces of my son and daughter-in-law. The screen displayed the pristine high-definition footage Leon had secured from the smoke detector camera. It was utterly irrefutable. The angle looked directly down onto the granite island in the kitchen. Rachel gasped, taking a frantic, stumbling step backward as she watched her own digital image pull the plastic prescription bottle from her white apron. The audio was flawless, picking up the heavy thud of the meat tenderizer crushing the illegal sedatives. The hidden microphones broadcasted her exact words, echoing through the living room with horrifying clarity. We watched the massive screen as she swept the toxic white powder into the simmering beef stew and stirred it with mechanical coldness. Detective Miller tapped the screen again, seamlessly switching the video feed to the camera hidden inside the hollowed encyclopedia. The perspective shifted to the exact room we were standing in. The television broadcasted Rachel violating my late wife's sacred jewelry box. Every single diamond earring and heavy gold chain she shoved into her designer purse was magnified in brilliant 4,000 pixel resolution. Her cruel, arrogant monologue filled the air as she gloated about bulldozing my home and using my medical committal to fund her new mansion in the hills. The sheer malice in her recorded voice stripped away any possible defense they could ever hope to mount in a court of law. Rachel let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, clutching her head with trembling, manicured hands. She shrieked that the video was manipulated, claiming it was a sophisticated digital fabrication designed by my lawyers to ruin her life. She looked wildly at the state fraud investigators, begging them to believe it was an elaborate setup orchestrated by a crazy, vindictive old man. She swore she had only come to check on my well-being and make me a final warm meal. Detective Miller did not even blink at her frantic performance. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a folded white document. It was the official toxicology report confirming the massive lethal dose of commercial narcotics present in the exact bag of soup I was currently pulling from the deep interior pocket of my heavy wool coat. I placed the thick plastic bag of contaminated stew onto the glass table right next to the blind trust documents. Rachel stared at the physical evidence, her eyes bulging with pure terror. She began to hyperventilate, curling into a pathetic, trembling ball on the floor as the inescapable reality of her impending prison sentence crashed down upon her. Gavin was entirely paralyzed. His chest heaved as he stared at the television screen, realizing his entire corporate empire and his personal freedom had just evaporated in a matter of seconds. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The deep paternal love I had harbored for 4 decades had been systematically eradicated. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on my knees. I looked directly into my son's hollow, panicked eyes, and I proceeded to systematically dismantle the core foundation of his entire existence. I told Gavin he was a complete financial failure. I watched his face contort in shock as I stripped away the grand illusion of his self-made corporate success. For 10 long years, Gavin strutted around the city believing his private security firm was staying afloat through his own brilliant business acumen and fierce negotiation skills. I explained to the silent room that his company had actually gone completely bankrupt a decade ago. His reckless spending and fundamental inability to manage basic logistics had driven his firm straight into the ground before he even reached his 30th birthday. Every single time he failed to secure a major contract or mismanaged his payroll, a silent, anonymous corporate holding company had injected emergency capital directly into his business accounts. I told him I was that anonymous holding company. I had secretly bailed him out month after month, year after year, paying his vendors and covering his massive debts so he would never have to face the humiliation of public ruin. I funneled the profits from my construction sites directly into his failing enterprise just to keep his fragile, arrogant ego intact. The realization hit Gavin like a physical blow to the stomach. His jaw trembled violently as the entire narrative of his life shattered into microscopic pieces. He had spent his entire adulthood looking down on my calloused hands and simple, quiet life, believing he was vastly superior because he wore a suit and carried a briefcase. Now he finally understood that his luxury vehicles, his expensive tailored suits, and his prestigious corporate office were bought and paid for by the sweat and blood of the man he was currently trying to murder. He possessed absolutely nothing of his own creation. He was a complete, total parasite living exclusively off the host he sought to destroy. Detective Miller raised his hand and signaled the 2 state fraud investigators. They moved forward with clinical, tactical precision. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs cut through the sound of Rachel weeping on the hardwood floor. An investigator grabbed Rachel by her expensive cashmere sweater, hoisting her off the floor and pinning her arms violently behind her back. The steel cuffs locked tightly around her wrists, digging into her skin. Detective Miller grabbed Gavin, shoving him roughly against the back of the leather sofa. He pulled Gavin's wrists together behind his back and secured them with a heavy final click. Miller read the list of criminal charges in a loud, steady voice that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. They were being arrested for felony elder abuse, breaking and entering, attempted poisoning, and grand larceny. Stephen stepped forward and added the final nail to the coffin, reminding them of the federal bank fraud charge for forging my signature on the corporate equity loan. Each individual charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a state or federal penitentiary. They were facing decades behind concrete walls wrapped in razor wire. The commercial developers would not be buying the property. The bank would instantly freeze every single asset connected to Gavin, named the moment Stephen filed the injunction. The complete eradication of their future was absolute and inescapable. Their arrogant illusion of control had been entirely inverted, and they were left with absolutely nothing but the terrifying consequences of their own boundless greed. Gavin realized the sheer magnitude of his destruction. His knees buckled completely, forcing Detective Miller to physically haul him upright by the collar of his winter coat. Gavin looked at me, and the arrogant corporate predator completely vanished. He instantly reverted to the exact same psychopathic performance he had utilized as a teenager on the side of that rainy highway. He began to violently weep. He forced thick, desperate tears to stream down his flushed face, letting his entire body shake with fabricated trauma. He begged me to call off the police. He shrieked that he was incredibly sorry, claiming the immense stress of his failing business had driven him temporarily insane. He swore he never actually intended to hurt me, and that he just needed the money to survive. He strained against the heavy steel handcuffs, pulling toward me with pathetic, naked desperation. "Dad, please, you have to stop them," he wailed, his voice cracking perfectly on cue as he tried to weaponize my fatherly instincts one last time. "I am your son. You cannot let them lock me away in a cage. We are family. We are blood." I stood up from the sofa, towering over the weeping, broken man who had planned to erase my entire history and turn my legacy into rubble. The quiet, legal victory was firmly secured, The financial perimeter was permanently locked. The physical threat against my life was neutralized in cold steel restraints. I looked at the pathetic artificial tears streaming down his face, and I felt absolutely no pity or remorse. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream in anger or seek any sadistic joy in his catastrophic downfall. I simply spoke the absolute unyielding truth, grounding the final moment in cold, inescapable reality. You ceased to be my son the night you opened my gas valve. Detective Miller yanked Gavin backward, dragging him forcefully toward the foyer, as his desperate sobs turned into frantic shrieks of panic. Rachel screamed hysterically as the state investigators hauled her out of the house, her designer shoes dragging across the floorboards. I stood perfectly still in the center of my living room and watched the heavy oak door slam shut permanently, severing the cancer from my life. The silent reckoning was finally over. The natural order had been restored, and the house was quiet once again. The morning air carried a sharp winter chill that felt entirely clean and untainted. It had been exactly 1 month since the heavy oak door closed behind the state investigators and the wailing protests of my son. I sat in the woven chair on my back patio, watching the first pale light of the sunrise bleed over the frosted tree line. The house behind me was completely pristine. Every room had been thoroughly scrubbed and restored to its quiet, natural state. The lingering scent of heavy floral perfume and bitter, anxious sweat had been entirely eradicated. The toxic presence that had invaded my sanctuary was permanently gone, leaving behind a solid, comfortable, empty space. I held a ceramic mug of dark coffee, letting the heat seep into my calloused palms. Leon sat in the chair next to me, blowing softly on his own steaming cup. We did not speak much. We were two old men who understood the profound value of a quiet, peaceful morning. The war had been fought entirely in the absolute shadows, and the ultimate victory required no loud public celebrations. The aftermath of the silent reckoning had been executed with the rapid, flawless precision of a corporate demolition. The legal fallout was delivered in quick surgical strikes by Stephen and his team of ruthless litigators. The federal court froze every single bank account associated with Gavin and his failing security firm within hours of his formal arrest. State marshals seized his luxury vehicles right out of the precinct parking lot. His prestigious corporate office was completely liquidated to pay the mandatory legal restitution he owed to his swindled vendors and the government. Rachel lost the sprawling modern house she had leveraged to the absolute limit to fund her vain lifestyle. The bank foreclosed on her property the moment her husband was indicted on multiple federal fraud charges. The authorities stripped away every single material possession they had ever valued or flaunted. They were left with absolutely nothing but the cheap state-issued uniforms they wore in their holding cells. The medical board acted with equal, unrelenting ferocity. They permanently revoked the license of Dr. Sterling, the corrupt clinic physician who had knowingly prescribed the heavy chemical sedatives. Stephen provided the federal prosecutors with the encrypted digital trail, proving the doctor had accepted a massive cash bribe from Gavin to falsify my psychological evaluation. Sterling was currently facing his own severe federal indictment for actively participating in the medical conspiracy. His entire lucrative career was reduced to a criminal case file sitting on a prosecutor desk. He would never wear a stethoscope or write a prescription again. The swiftness of the justice system was a beautiful testament to the undeniable power of concrete physical evidence. My entire financial legacy was safely locked away inside the irrevocable charitable trust. Stephen had filed the final transfer documents, cementing the corporate holding company as the permanent, unyielding owner of my estate. The immense wealth I had built over 40 years of grueling manual labor was entirely insulated from any future greedy hands. The state foster organization was already utilizing the initial corporate dividends to build a massive new housing facility for abandoned children in the city. They were purchasing warm beds and hiring dedicated teachers for kids who had never known a safe, reliable home. I had shielded Gavin from the harsh, brutal realities of the foster system I endured as a child. But now those exact children would inherit the empire he so desperately tried to steal. It was the ultimate poetic balance of the universe. The money that was meant to fund a vain, arrogant lifestyle was now actively securing the future of the truly vulnerable. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching a pair of red cardinals land on the frozen birdbath in the center of the yard. I felt absolutely no sadistic joy over the destruction of my son. There was no triumphant celebration or lingering petty vindictiveness in my heart. I felt only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a veteran contractor who had successfully identified a massive structural failure and decisively cut the rotting wood out of the foundation. I had spent my entire adult life building safe, sturdy structures for other people to live in. When I found toxic mold or severe termite damage in a main support beam, I did not feel angry at the wood. I simply brought out the heavy steel saw and removed the terrible danger before the entire house could collapse into rubble. Gavin was the creeping rot in my foundation. I had removed him with the exact same detached clinical precision. The natural order of my universe had been entirely restored. The parasites had been cleanly removed, and the host body was finally allowed to heal in peace. Leon finished his coffee and placed the empty mug on the small iron table between us. He gave me a single respectful nod, acknowledging the permanent peace we had finally secured together. He stood up slowly, pulling his thick wool coat tight against the biting winter wind, and walked back toward his own property across the frozen yard. I watched him navigate the icy grass, appreciating the rare loyalty of a man who knew exactly how to operate in the silent, dangerous spaces of the world. I remained seated on the patio, letting the bright morning sun warm my face. The heavy glass door leading into my kitchen was open just a few inches to let in the crisp, fresh air. From deep inside the quiet house, the sharp electronic ringing of the kitchen landline broke the silence. The sudden sound echoed off the clean granite countertops and spilled out onto the patio. I did not rush to answer it. I did not feel my heart rate spike or my muscles tense with old paternal anxiety. I set my coffee mug down on the table and stood up slowly, feeling the familiar dull ache in my knees. I walked calmly through the sliding glass door and stepped onto the clean hardwood floor of the kitchen. The caller identification screen on the wall phone glowed with a bright blue light in the shadows of the room. The digital text clearly displayed the county correctional facility. Gavin was calling from a cold, concrete block, using his single allocated phone call to reach out to the man he had tried to erase. He was likely standing in a noisy, crowded room surrounded by hardened criminals, terrified and completely desperate for a familiar, comforting voice. He wanted to beg for a high-priced lawyer. He wanted to cry and manipulate and twist the painful truth one last time. He wanted his father to swoop in and rescue him from the catastrophic consequences of his own horrific actions. I stood in front of the ringing phone, watching the blue light flash against the white wall. I did not sigh. I did not hesitate or feel a single shred of paternal guilt. I reached down to the wooden baseboard and wrapped my fingers around the thick plastic wire. I simply unplugged the cord directly from the wall socket. The frantic ringing stopped instantly. The blue light faded into total, absolute blackness. I dropped the dead wire onto the floor. I turned around, walked back out to the patio, and leaned heavily into my chair, surrendering entirely to the profound, unbroken silence. The lesson learned from this ordeal is that true family is defined by mutual respect and fundamental decency rather than mere biological connection. When boundless generosity is met with calculated predatory greed, maintaining unconditional love becomes a dangerous act of self-destruction. It is entirely necessary to establish unyielding boundaries and protect your own peace, even if it means permanently severing ties with those you once cherished the most. Unrelenting truth and quiet, decisive action will always overpower arrogant manipulation, allowing you to restore the natural order of your life and safeguard your hard-earned legacy for those who genuinely deserve it. If you found this story of silent reckoning and reclaimed dignity satisfying, please share your thoughts and subscribe for more narratives.